Good morning from the United States and good afternoon to those in the UK, Europe, and the rest of the world. It is my pleasure to join you all today for the launch of Watchkeepers International new platform. In these complex and uncertain times, it's invaluable to have a tool for monitoring global crises and the intersection between violent events, natural disasters, and public health emergencies. 1 year into the global pandemic, no corner of the world has remained unharmed. The worldwide coronavirus death toll has surpassed 2.5 million lives. We have witnessed a global economic slowdown as countries move to lockdown to protect their citizens and contain the deadly pandemic. Several economic sectors will be impacted for years to come: trade, education, travel and transportation, tourism, hospitality, entertainment, and many others. We have witnessed a global shift to the online space as businesses and other entities pivoted to virtual and remote operations. Unfortunately, throughout the pandemic, we have continued to see terrorist organizations, extremist movements, and violent individuals capitalize and thrive in this climate. Extremist recruitment and propaganda have proliferated. The online space is riddled with hateful content, extremist propaganda, and conspiracy theories. In the United States, we have seen communities targeted and victimized, to include violent attacks against Asian Americans, increased anti Semitism, and a rise in domestic violence incidents. Within this context, I will focus on three key areas and how they are likely to impact a global post pandemic terrorism threat landscape. First, the threat from Salafi jihadi inspired terrorism. Second, the threat from the far right and violent white supremacy. And third, the rise of conspiracy theories and disinformation. To begin, we must keep our eyes on the enduring threat from Salafi jihadi inspired terrorism. Diminished by law enforcement and military operation and the COVID-19 pandemic, groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda continue to pose a lingering threat. Very little impact have been made to confront the ideology and narrative of such groups. Thus, their threat still remains. Further, both the so-called Islamic State and Al-Qaeda are increasingly acting through regional affiliates embedded in local dynamics and conflicts, rather than their centralized operational core. Although ISIS has lost territorial control and Al-Qaeda much of its leadership, both retain significant influence and operational capabilities through regional affiliates. In West Africa, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, the Lake Chad Basin, and the Sahel, Islamic State affiliates continue to cooperate and destabilize the region. We also see upticks in violence and destabilization along the southeastern Swahili coast in Tanzania and Mozambique. In Afghanistan, where cooperation between Taliban and Al-Qaeda may be affected by ongoing peace talks, the Islamic State Khorasan province may be able to peel away hardliners dissatisfied with the reconciliation. The impact of COVID-19 introduced several uncertainties regarding the trajectory of Salafi jihadist-inspired terrorism. In Europe, for example, the past few years have seen more low-tech, low-cost attacks perpetrated by individuals or small groups without direct affiliations with a group like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. This trend continued, with individuals or smaller groups carrying out recent attacks in France, Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. With pandemic restrictions limiting movements and access to targets, large-scale attacks have not been likely. However, this period of relative quiet may provide opportunities for planning and preparing for sophisticated attacks when the restrictions are lifted and when the public begins gathering again at markets, at concerts, and festivals. As restrictions are eased in the West, companies and urban areas will need to remain vigilant with regards to mass transit, public gatherings, and other spaces vulnerable to mass casualty attacks, including soft targets like shopping centers. From a global business perspective, companies will also need to remain vigilant about new areas of concerns where local security situations may have deteriorated over the course of the pandemic, to include tourism and business travel to locations like Mozambique or Tanzania or other regions formerly less associated with Salafi jihadist-inspired terrorism. Second, the rise of threat from far-right and violent white supremacy. The entire Western world, from North America to Europe to Australia and beyond, must take seriously the rising threat from violence instigated by white supremacists and other far-right violent extremists. In a post-pandemic world, we face disadvantages when addressing this challenge. The United States and much of Western Europe and the world spent the past 2 decades almost singularly focused on the threat posed by Salafi jihadism. Government and security agencies have been less prepared in responding to this challenge. Also, we have long had a double standard in counterterrorism, even though violence is violence and terrorism is terrorism. The attacks in Norway in 2011 and Christchurch, New Zealand in 2019 have invited closer scrutiny on global white supremacy extremism. This scrutiny reveals that, like the global jihadist movement, violent white supremacists and far-right actors maintain international linkages and continue to forge global networks, with ideologue radicalizing individuals across the globe. Both Andres Breivik and Brenton Tarrant drew inspiration from grievances and causes originated in other countries, while each presented himself as a defender of global European white civilization. We have seen the conflict in Ukraine emerging as a hub in the broader network of transnational white supremacy extremism, attracting foreign recruits from all over. Where jihadis once traveled to fight in places like Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, white supremacists create their own theater in which to network, build relations, and learn combat. This place is Ukraine, where the conflict between pro-Russian separatist and Ukrainian government forces has been ongoing since 2014, attracting fighters from around the globe who are taking advantage of the Ukrainian conflict for their own aims and goals. So what can we expect in a post-pandemic world from this threat? A chief concern is increased networking, fundraising, and recruiting. For example, over the pandemic, these extremists will have forged strong online relationships, and they are likely to want to take those relationships a step further through meetups and opportunities to bond and plot in person. Another concern is that reopening will provide space again for these groups and individuals to convene at international events. Previously, we have seen activities like mixed martial arts, MMA clubs, neo-Nazi music festivals, and ultra-nationalist commemorations and events provide pretext for extremists from all over the world to gather and gain strength. As our societies and businesses look forward to returning to normal, we should be concerned about an emboldened and transnational far-right threat. This was most dramatically illustrated at the events of January 6 in Washington, D.C. during the storming of the U.S. Capitol building. However, events before and after that day showed an increased momentum among domestic U.S. violent extremist groups and growing transnational connections among white supremacy extremists. Although the insurrection was unsuccessful in attaining its objectives, far-right violent groups across the world have lauded the effort and seen the attempt as a seed for potential future models. The imagery from that day may serve as a critical inspiration for violent far-right extremists worldwide. 3. The threat from conspiracy theories and disinformation. The widespread disinformation campaigns about COVID-19, about 5G technology, anti-vaccination, about QAnon, among many others, may give rise to more violent anti-government movements. In the US, we have seen the worrying intersection between conspiracy theories and calls for violence and domestic terrorism. Furthermore, we could also see heightened discrimination targeting communities in some way associated with the effects of the pandemic, including healthcare workers or advocates or government proponents of preventive measures. A COVID-19 testing center was recently bombed in the Netherlands. Protests have been staged to disrupt vaccination clinics in the US. As communities are falsely and maliciously linked to these conspiracy theories, they become more vulnerable to attack, as we have witnessed with the Asian American community in the United States and the increased threat against Jewish houses of worship and community centers that is directly connected to the rise of anti-Semitism. At the same time, with young people increasingly spending more time online, violent extremist groups across the ideological spectrum have further opportunities to spread their narrative, to recruit, and even to mobilize. Finally, nearly 2 decades after the attacks of September 11, 2001 in the United States, the global terrorism landscape looked more diffuse and diverse. A centralized core of transnational groups have today been replaced with networks, with regional affiliates, and with more ideologically diverse violent groups. This complex terrorism landscape is further compounded by civil unrests and the devastating impact of natural disasters, which will each be addressed by my co-panelists later in this event. As communities continue to reel from social, economic, and personal losses, violent extremist groups can further capitalize on the soaring societal and economic losses from the pandemic. Against that backdrop, businesses and companies developing plans and processes for a return to business as usual and to national and international business travel and operations must be mindful of this evolution. Our post-pandemic response must reflect the reality of the threat as it exists today, not as it was a year ago. Thank you all for your time, and I look forward to our discussion.